morning, good evening, good afternoon to everybody joining us from all different places across the globe. As I was just saying earlier, I can't believe we're already on day 3 of Digital Identity Week. Soon it will be over, so we'll have to enjoy and make the most of every single moment that we've got together today and tomorrow before we begin to wrap up for the week. For those of you that are joining the call that don't know me before, my name is Sarah Corley. I'm the community convener for DFI, so it's to convene weeks such as this one and activities like community of practice and webinars. All the activities that I will lead are actually free, so I encourage you to share all the activities with your colleagues. For those who are maybe not able to currently access the DFI courses, at least they can stay in touch with DFI through the opportunities we offer via our communities. I'm very happy to be joined, of course, as always, by Nawazi and David. Good afternoon to you both, or good morning, David, really.
Hi, Sarah. Hi, everyone.
Hello, Sarah, and hello, everyone.
So just a couple of housekeeping things from my side before I hand over to Nawazi, who's going to set the scene for today's call and introduce our guest speaker. So just to remind you, we are recording the session, and again, we'll share the link with you all via YouTube and also in our campus, which should happen later on today. If not by early tomorrow morning, those will be for you to watch. And we're also going to be taking questions from you today. So you can do that in 2 ways, either using the raise your hand function, and then I will come to you with a question, or you can pop your question in the chat as we go through as well. And we'll do our best to get round to every single one of you with your questions while we're on the call today. So without further ado, let me hand over to my colleague, Nawazi, who's going to tell you a little bit more about the focus of today's call. Over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Sarah. So, and thank you to everyone who's joined again, and thank you for seeing a lot of familiar names I've been seeing across the days. So thank you for being consistently here with us. Today we're looking at a different lens for digital identity and looking at it from the mobile side. And this is why we've got Yanis from GSMA here today to give us a presentation. And if you have any questions while he's presenting, please feel free to post those in the chat, or you can wait for when he finishes and raise your hands at the end to ask him any questions. Just to briefly introduce him, and before I hand over to him for him to start with this presentation, he's a senior director for GSMA's Mobile for Development Group. And if you had checked Campus, you've already seen that I've put up an introduction to Yanis, so I won't spend too much time talking about it much, but just to mention for this discussion that he is the Digital Identity Program Lead, and so that's why we're here today with him and looking forward to his insights for us today. Thank you, and I hand over to you, Yanis, to continue with the conversation.
Excellent. Thank you, Nawazi, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thank you to the DFI for inviting me to participate. It's a pleasure to be here, and hope that the insights I'll share today will be helpful to Eswatini colleagues as they develop their digital ID sort of ecosystem. Now, sort of before I sort of kick off, I don't know if many or all of you have heard of the GSMA. GSMA is basically the Mobile Industry Trade Association and represent about 800 or so mobile operators worldwide. And I lead, as was mentioned, the Digital ID program at the GSMA's Mobile for Development unit. I'll just share some slides. I think I'll make my presentation more visually sort of easier to follow. Yeah. So yes, today I'll be talking about the role of mobile as an enabler of digital identity and digital financial services. And I mentioned that we are part of a group within the GSMA that is predominantly donor funded. We're very lucky to be receiving funds from the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office here in London, as well as from many of our members. Now, the main mission of our program is, as you can see in your slides, is to explore and advocate for the various roles that mobile operators and mobile tech can play as an enabler of digital identity and improve access to services which provide both social but also commercial value in developing markets. So that's our sort of raison d'etre of the program. Before I sort of touch on the identity aspects, I wanted to take a step back and offer some sort of the picture on mobile and how important mobile is and has been in the developing world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, globally, mobile, as you know, is the platform with the highest reach, with about 5.2 billion unique subscribers, and that's about 6-7% of the global population. You know, adding new subscribers is increasingly difficult as markets become more saturated, especially in Africa, and the economies of reaching rural populations become more difficult to justify in a challenging climate for mobile operators. But while mobile connectivity, as you can see on the slide, and penetration across sub-Saharan Africa is improving, still only about half of the population are unique mobile subscribers in their own name, and half of those have a smartphone. But you know, this is projected to increase to about 6-7% by 2025, as you can see in our latest mobile economy report, from where I picked those statistics. And in terms of the role of mobile in financial inclusion, I like this slide because it helps visualize how big mobile money is in many countries, where mobile is the only means through which an individual can be both digitally and financially included. So as you can see here, mobile money continues to reach the poorest and sort of most financially excluded. So the bottom right quadrant there on your screen shows that mobile money penetration is highest in the poorer countries with large unbanked populations. All those big dark blue dots represent countries, and the size of the dot is proportional to the percentage of the unbanked population that uses mobile money. So they don't have a bank account, but they have a mobile money account. And as you can see, there are quite a few countries predominantly use mobile money to be financially included. And you know, how big is mobile money overall? Well, the snapshot sort of slide that I'm sharing now shows how big mobile money has become. 2019 has been a milestone year, with the number of registered mobile money accounts surpassing the 1 billion mark. In sub-Saharan Africa alone, 50 million new accounts were opened, about 290 deployments are live in 95 countries, and for the first time ever, the percentage of all digital transaction values now exceeds the cash in and cash out values. So in other words, more money is circulating than exiting the mobile money ecosystem. And we're talking about a volume of 22 billion USDs. Just some sort of more contextual stats here. So recent analysis by the GSMA showed that you know, an increasing number of digital transactions are driven by mobile money. For example, a third of active users receive their salaries via mobile money. 73% of mobile money providers partner with agribusinesses and cooperatives, and 61% of mobile money bill payments involve utilities. So more and more people are using mobile to go about their lives and sort of support or pay for bills and so on. And now comes the link to identity. So this graphic looks at the countries where mobile money services are available against the share of adult population in each country with an official form of identity. Now, we estimated that almost 500 million adults, the dark blue shaded area on the left there, lives in these countries, who live in these countries lack an ID and are therefore unlikely to be able to meet the requisite KYC credentials or requirements, which means they're the higher risk of being financially excluded, even though a mobile money kiosk may be available down the road from their house. So clearly a big opportunity that's sort of kindly missed, and also sort of $500 billion to be excluded financially because they lack an official ID, and that's using World Bank figures. And if we take another step back, the ability of an individual to be onboarded to digital financial services in their own name relies on the ability to access a SIM card in their own name, which itself relies on having an acceptable proof of identity. And as I'll touch on the next slide, sort of more than 155 countries mandate proof of ID for registering a SIM card, and that's the case across the developing world and Africa. Now, we mapped out the identity coverage in most of the developing world against the mobile penetration in those countries. And it's evident, as you can see here, that in almost all countries, the two lines are parallel, suggesting a strong direct correlation between access to identity and access to mobile in one's own name. Interestingly, we are currently conducting research among MNOs in 31 countries, mainly across Africa, LATAM, and Middle East. And 57% of MNOs say that they experience fairly regularly lack of required ID as a barrier to onboarding customers to SIM cards or mobile money accounts. So this is an issue in practice, and it has been documented both from the MNO side, but also from consumers, and also World Bank and other international bodies. Now let's look at the SIM registration sort of side of things, and the policy that I'm sure you're all familiar with, and how this impacts or could impact the COVID context. It's no secret that governments in many countries and central banks rather are looking into remote customer onboarding to DFS, especially in the light of lockdown restrictions and so on. But we have seen that, as I mentioned before, many countries rely on more money for their financial inclusion. But in order to conduct remote or electronic KYC and onboard customers remotely, companies have to be able to validate people's official ID credentials remotely or electronically. And of the 155 countries that require or mandate SIM registration for more money services or for SIM cards, only 19 countries enable the capability for mobile operators to validate the customer's ID digitally currently. And this is usually done by asking MNOs to capture biometrics or either querying them against a government database or against a token stored in a smart card or sort of national ID with a chip card and so on. But as we see lockdown restrictions becoming more widespread and prevalent, I think that there's a need for governments to rethink regulations in this context and explore mobile-based solutions to ensure that the most vulnerable groups are not excluded from accessing mobile and more money services remotely. And I think technology and startup sectors have a lot to offer to bridge this gap. And I'll touch on this a bit later on. Now, I thought it's worth sort of touching on the gender gap here as well, because this is quite an interesting sort of point to note, and not to be sort of forgetful of the fact that women and men sort of have different dynamics to accessing services, including ID and digital ID. And in the context of SIM registration, I think it's worth looking at this results from the World Bank's Findex or latest Findex survey, which showed that applying for a mobile SIM card or mobile services is the most prevalent use of an ID across all countries for both men and women, but also it has the greatest gender gap, indicated that more women than men lack the required ID to access mobile services. And I mean, there are a number of factors why women are less likely than men to own an ID and may use other means to apply for a SIM card, or sort of use a relative's name, or asking them to get a SIM card on their behalf and so on. And again, we've done research to identify those factors. But I think that the point remains that we see many governments using SIM registration as a way to drive identity registration, because they know that people will want to get a SIM card in their own name. Therefore, they're more likely to go out and get an ID or sign up for a digital ID where this is currently offered or about to be offered, if they are forced to link that ID to the SIM card in order to be in their own name. And obviously, one has to be mindful of the potential exclusionary implications that these kinds of policies may have if an individual or more vulnerable groups are unable to register for an ID for various reasons. So just flagging that again as something for the government of Eswatini to be mindful of. So what are some of the policies that Eswatini could adopt to improve financial inclusion, particularly among women? I think Nigeria offers an insightful sort of case study, and you can see here on the slide. The Nigerian Central Bank has had a national financial inclusion strategy, which aims to ensure that all Nigerians, particularly the underserved, can access financial products and services. And there are sort of 5 core initiatives that they are pursuing, which again are worth quickly touching on. The first one is encouraging women to become mobile agents, including mobile money vendors, and we've seen that the presence of female mobile agents can encourage or facilitate mobile uptake among women. And there's evidence that shows mobile female customers are more comfortable interacting with female agents. The second initiative is introducing tiered KYC requirements. I'm sure this is something you may have all come across, but tiered KYC essentially allows an individual to access the basic product, the basic wallet, with in most cases no ID required, or sort of non-formal ID required, maybe a passport-sized photo, name and address to register. And then as that individual accesses more formal sort of IDs, they can sort of upgrade their accounts to ones that can allow them to transact higher amounts or save higher amounts, and so on. Third initiative is about creating products by or for women, and that touched on the demand side, because particularly for digital and financial services that are customized for women's needs and cater for their needs lead to increased uptake of those services by women. Fourthly, providing national ID numbers to all Nigerians. Again, I'll touch on this in a few minutes, but basically having ways for Nigerians for citizens to access a national ID or formal ID document easily. So not just having your centers in urban locations and sort of making it difficult for those far away or in rural populations to access. And Nigeria is doing something very interesting about this. So they are partnering with the private sector, including mobile operators, to essentially license them to become official government partners in enrollment, leveraging their nationwide reach to sign up individuals for their national ID. And obviously they won't be keeping data themselves, but they'll be sort of sending data to the relevant authority and enrolling individuals in remote locations to the national ID platform. And I think this is certainly a message or a practice that could be considered by the bigger countries out there, where reaching the last mile or the most remote individuals is challenging or costly. And the last sort of pillar there is the security and data privacy pillar, which is ensuring trust and building trust by having relevant security and privacy practices when expanding digital ID ecosystems. And again, I'll touch on this in a bit more detail later on. Now this slide looks busy, but essentially it's just a snapshot showing the various factors that contribute to digital transformation. And we see here digital ID acting as both an enabler but also a driver of transformation. We've mapped out the main factors impacting the readiness of a country to digitally transform. And as we all know, for consumers and citizens of a country to be able to become digital participants in an economy, they need to be able to assert their identity online and digitally. So digital ID is a prerequisite for a robust digital economy. And we've split the key sort of pillars of such transformation, as you can see here. It boils down to governments, markets, and consumers being ready. And in the third sort of column there, the sort of row there, you can see the main attributes or factors that impact or contribute to that readiness becoming increasing. So from left to right, we've got, obviously you need political will and the vision across government. I think a number of speakers over the last 2 days mentioned the need for coordination among government departments who have a vested interest in a country's ID. So you can't expect just the National ID Authority or the central bank to do it by themselves. So you need coordination among all the various ministries, regulators, and authorities that that mandate ID requirements, or where reaching individuals is a key sort of is within the scope of what they do. Obviously, conducive laws and regulations is key, from privacy and cybersecurity, taxation, and so on. Electricity and connectivity coverage. So what are what is the coverage around the country, and sort of what are the policies and incentives that the government can offer to ensure connectivity is extended to reach the last mile on the supply side, and then on the demand side, are there incentives to help develop the right services, from healthcare to financial services to social benefits, government, education, and so on. So you need those services to drive demands. Otherwise, people won't bother to A, get an ID or digital ID, and B, link it to the ecosystem and use it to access services online. And then on the consumer side, there, as you can see, obviously, so the flip side is that they need to be able to access both a digital ID, but also from an affordability perspective and a literacy perspective, what are some of the policies the government can support to close the affordability gap or the literacy gap that exists currently. And also the status of individuals. So we should be mindful that countries don't have just citizens residing there, but you can have residents but non-citizens, and also refugees or other displaced populations who may not all have access to the same ID infrastructure in a country. So what are some of the policies in place to ensure that those individuals are not left behind by your digital ID ecosystem development? And yes, willingness to adopt is the last sort of factor, which is the flip side to the demand side services. In other words, you may have the services, you may offer an easy access to those services, but what about trust? Are people willing to and sort of trustworthy, sort of the trust in the government and the private sector with their data, or do they feel that they may be either prosecuted, or that the data may be shared with third parties or with government, and that could result in decisions that may impact their lives and so on? So what are the checks and balances in place that can build trust? I think this slide is probably a bit redundant, given that I would want to preach to the converted. To be here, it means that you already know and appreciate the benefits of a good digital ID ecosystem for government. So I will not read the slides, but maybe you can quickly scan through it. I'll touch on these challenges that we've identified over the last sort of 5 years of existence of our program. We've done quite a few research studies, both with consumers, with governments, with MNOs and other development actors. And these sort of 6 challenges are the ones that are more prevalent across the board. And I think it's something that governments should be mindful of when developing services. But also, as you can see, the arrow pointing downwards, we feel that access to mobile platforms can facilitate, or mitigate those challenges by helping governments address them. So what are the challenges? Well, firstly, we're seeing the demand issue I mentioned earlier. So many people do not see the value of taking up a new digital ID, especially if there's no tangible benefit to them personally. Secondly, if it's far or costly or too costly to travel to the nearest enrollment center, individuals, especially women, are more likely to be excluded. Thirdly, cultural norms, such as many women not being used to carry an ID with them, may act as a barrier to enrollment, especially in the more patriarchal societies. Fourthly, if people are generally allowed to use multiple functional IDs to verify their identity, vulnerable groups, including women, may be less incentivized to sign up for a national ID. So in other words, if you want to drive quick uptake of your new digital ID, don't allow 20 different types of functional ID documents to be used, because people want the value in getting a digital ID. Fifthly, lack of digital skills and literacy levels among women specifically impact on their ability to access electronic services that rely on proving their identity digitally. And finally, policies and regulations at national or regional level may play a role. For example, as I mentioned before, lack of privacy frameworks can give rise to concerns around who can access their personal data and may impact women's willingness to access ID-linked digital services. So this slide captures pretty much the various roles that we see mobile operators playing in the digital ID ecosystem, and have been exploring many of these. But just to maybe decipher what you see on your screens here, there are 2 sides or 2 main roles we see MNOs playing. On the left-hand side, you see the supply side problem, which is people not having access to an official foundational ID. As I mentioned in the case of Nigeria, we feel that MNOs could act as government partners to support the enrollment into a new national digital ID platform or birth registration platform, because they've got unparalleled nationwide reach and expertise in dealing with customer data. Now, on the demand side, on the right, MNOs can play a big role in remote customer identity verification. For example, because they've got access to those attributes you can see there on the top, whether it's SIM reg data, whether it's more money, transactional data, handset data, phone number, biometrics, how frequently a customer tops up their airtime or adds money to their account, their location, and so on. So all these attributes can be leveraged by MNOs to build some sort of higher level of assurance that an individual or the customer they know is indeed the same person trying to access a service. And that sort of functionality can help verify that customer digitally and remotely, when trying to access any type of service, like the ones listed there on the right. So partnering with third-party service providers can also work to drive demand. And we have been working with a number of projects and partners to explore such innovations further. I'll give a few examples right now, actually. So on the supply side that I mentioned, we have a systematic area. Digital birth registration has been something we've been working on quite heavily over the past few years, and we've got lots of resources and reports on this, and sort of closely worked with partners, including MNOs and governments in Pakistan, Tanzania, and Ghana to support public-private partnerships based on leveraging the power of mobile to help parents register their newborns and essentially cut the bureaucracy and length of the process from what previously used to be or to take months to a few hours or even minutes in some cases. And happy to share those resources offline if colleagues are interested. And on the demand side, as I mentioned, we do have a number of live projects working with mobile operators in various countries. Again, trying to explore that role between using your phone and your mobile number and the fact that your MNO knows who you are to unlock access to other services. So I'll briefly touch on this four. So in Kenya, we're working with a big MNO there to work on a health ID solution where the individuals, the mobile users, will be able to link it to their patient records and be able to essentially to control their data, but also book appointments with their healthcare provider or share anything about their medical history they want to with a doctor on the go, on the move. In Somaliland, and that's part of our humanitarian program, we're working with a voice on a voice ID solution that essentially allows the individuals, so allows the individuals to identify themselves by saying a few words, and then their voice is used to recognize who they are remotely. So that's a digital footprint, and that enhances the accountability and efficiency of cash programs. And a very similar example, but not with voice, in Zambia, where two of our members there are supporting government reach beneficiaries of social safety net programs by verifying the identity of those beneficiaries, by virtue of their mobile numbers and what they know about them. And again, that creates efficiencies and improves the verification of such social protection programs by ensuring that the intended beneficiary is reached, and that also limits or reduces fraud as well. And finally, in Nigeria, we are also working with a partner there on a solution that targets small business owners between 1 and 5 employees who traditionally have been unable to access bank loans or credit, or because they may be facing reputational issues and couldn't sort of actually vouch for their businesses as well, and using their mobile money accounts that are linked to the business. This solution is about allowing access to credit, but also building a reputation of the business based on that sort of credit worthiness that is being formed and provided to the entity. I think sort of going to my final few slides, I want to touch on this sort of broader theme of trust, which is key to having a robust and accessible digital ID ecosystem. Interesting, and through the research we've done, the majority of countries requiring an ID have a data protection framework in place, but still about 41% of countries do not. And again, we've seen through our end user research that people are more reluctant or willing to access or sign up for digital ID where the country lacks a sufficient and substantial or comprehensive privacy and data protection framework, or where the government access framework, so basically where governments requires data from a private sector entity, e.g. an MNO, has no checks and balances. So all these issues have to be considered in advance of finalizing a digital ID framework, so that trust is built before the green light is on. I know I mentioned quite a few factors earlier that impact on the ability and the robustness of a country to roll out an effective digital ID ecosystem. This just highlights maybe 5 of the key ones. I mean, just again, very quickly, we found that you need comprehensive ID registries, whether they are foundational or functional. You need multiple and diverse enrollment options to ensure that the last mile and those in remote and rural areas are able to register. And again, that's where partnerships with MNOs could be considered. We need well-defined credentials. So you need to specify what form of digital credentials should be captured as part of this new digital ID ecosystem, and we definitely promote vendor neutrality, so that if a government decides to change the standards or the vendor down the line, they're not locked in into an arrangement that would make it difficult for them to do so. Robust authentication mechanisms. I think that's something that the speakers yesterday also touched on. And that's separate to standards, because you need the hardware to make sure that whatever the relevant requirements are captured adequately, and also they are readable and scannable and so on at different locations. And finally, consumer safeguards, which I mentioned a lot, and the need to ensure trust is ingrained. And my final slide, I believe, is about the key policy considerations in terms of building and leveraging digital ID ecosystems, assuming you would like to leverage mobile platforms for supporting digital and financial inclusion objectives. I think the one thing that, again, I mentioned earlier, but also I think quite a few speakers mentioned over the last 2 days, is the need for proactive engagement between the relevant regulators, ministries, and authorities, and having a very clear and conducive pathway to for both nationals and non-nationals to access connectivity and financial services in their own name, because we don't believe someone is truly financially and digitally included if they can only access a service through a relative or through a third person. They have to be able to do it in their own name, and to do that they need access to ID. They need to be able to access a service in their own name and in their own right. How to do that? Well, we spoke about expanding coverage and accessibility of your digital ID enrollment centers, and that's where mobile network operator partnerships can be effective. We spoke about improving reliability by enabling mobile operators to validate customers' ID credentials remotely, and that's again key for the current COVID context. I think the third one is about harmonizing identity-related KYC for mobile money with SIM registration requirements. Again, we're seeing many countries where the central bank has different ID requirements for the financial sector, and then the telco regulator has a different set for SIM card registration. And again, for MNOs that play a role across those two buckets, it becomes more challenging to be able to comply across those two sets of ID requirements. So how can we harmonize the two? We spoke about tiered KYC, and again, allowing the lowest sort of tier of wallets to be accessible without very stringent ID requirements, as per the latest FATF recommendations. Literacy and skills, again, a big chapter that needs to be looked at, and I think there's a lot that government and private sector can do working together to promote education and literacy among those who lack those skills, and finally, again, trust through appropriate privacy and security frameworks that have to be in place. I believe that sums up my introduction or my presentation. I've got my email here if you would like to get in touch. I also will conclude by saying that we offer a one-day capacity building course to governments who wishing to find out more about how to leverage mobile in their digital ID journeys. This course is offered free of charge to governments. So please do reach out if you feel this may be of interest. We can offer it both online and in person, but obviously not now due to COVID restrictions. But yeah, thought I'd flag this for your consideration. So thank you very much, and I'm now open to any questions that you may have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Yanis. That was a really comprehensive, but also, you know, a good overview as well of the role that mobile can play. We've got quite a few questions coming in, so I'm going to take Kim's question first, which Kojo also replied to. But the use of MNO ID is dependent on the integrity of the SIM card registration. So Kim is from South Africa, and she says that there's not very much trust in the registration process there. How can we ensure that that is more reliable? And Kojo has suggested perhaps preventing pre-registration of the SIM can help with reliability. What are your thoughts?
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's important to know or to think about the order of events or the sequence of events. Clearly, if you start from a point where you've got SIM registration laws, but your identity coverage is not robust enough, then by definition, your SIM registration databases will not be robust either. And that's why when thinking about moving from a physical ID world to a digital ID world, what's the right sort of sequence? And what we sort of promote and advocate is that working in partnership with MNOs can help governments establish a robust digital ID infrastructure, and then the MNOs can easily switch or update their customers' databases, their customers' details, with the new digital ID credentials that customer will obtain. But in the absence of digital ID, totally agree that the MNO's data will not be 100% foolproof, because they can only check what they can see, right? But if they're not allowed, or there's no empowerment, there's no functionality for them to check someone's ID, what can they do, right? So basically, the robustness of a SIM registration exercise is entirely dependent on the ability of MNO to verify the credential of the person in front of them, not the other way around. And you know, and as I'm sure, you know, quite a few speakers mentioned, establishing and offering a foundational national ID should be the government's sort of concern and also remit, not the private sectors. But certainly, I've outlined a few examples of how the private sector, including MNOs, can help the government do that, but also then improve the level of identity assurance where it's currently very low. And I'm not saying to a foolproof extent, but at least they know something about the customers that can help a third-party provider identify the beneficiary or the customer to a higher level of assurance.
Okay, thank you so much. And staying on that topic of trust, we've got a couple of questions from Jill about the topic of trust. So firstly, about thinking about the consumer. So when you have things like just happened in Uganda, mobile money fraud, that was, I mean, for a lot of us on the call, that was something we've discussed and seen a lot of conversations around. How does that potentially impact the trust of people have within MNOs, and whether they really want them to be able to have access to even more information about them than they currently have? And then the second part of that is how is GSMA working with and how can mobile providers work with governments to get them to trust them as well? So at both ends of the scale, how can you influence trust for both the government and the ordinary citizen?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, on Uganda, I can't speak specifically on the recent sort of case, because I know it's still sort of being investigated and so on. But what I can say is that as GSMA, on the more money business, we have an accreditation scheme, a very robust scheme, that where more money providers can sign up for being audited and so on, and then they get the accreditation once they do. And that is a very sort of independently assessed and very robust accreditation. So that's one way in which we would try to sort of help those with the better practices stand out, if you want. But on the privacy sides, what we have seen across the board is that our members go above and beyond what the legal frameworks of the country is. So, for example, many of the group companies who are headquartered in the US or the UK or in Europe adopt a GDPR approach across their footprint countries, including those in Africa, even where a privacy and data protection framework is not present there. The one area where there's more challenging, and it's happy to touch on, is what we call the government access requests. In other words, when the government knocks the door of an MNO and asks for personal details about someone's call data records, in the light of sort of supporting security or an ongoing investigation. And I think that's where we see many MNOs pushing back on requests if they don't see the requisite sort of threshold of justification being met. And many countries do have checks and balances that limit or define the extent to which and when governments should ask for details about customers' communications data. But where they don't, I think that's where we see trust issues appearing. So we certainly advocate for such government requests or government access requests to be provided in clearly defined sort of frameworks and checks and balances.
And then moving on to David's question, David was asking about the accuracy, I suppose, of the voice recognition. So obviously you talked about in one of the examples that you gave, I can't remember which one it was now, but using voice biometrics, how accurate is voice in comparison to maybe a fingerprint or iris?
No, it's quite accurate, actually, yes. And we're seeing this use case being quite recently being of interest to many partners. So we've been working in Somaliland with a partner there. In Kenya, Safaricom also has a voice ID solution for their customers, and we're seeing other countries also looking at this. I believe, especially in a world where many people don't have smartphones but have proper basic handsets, voice is something that can easily be or the voice biometrics something that can be provided, but not fingerprints or face scans and so on. And with the right algorithmic and software and so on, they can store pretty accurate sort of voice biometric and then match it against your live voice when trying to access a service or make a transaction and so on. And I'm sure we'll see more innovations in this space in the coming years.
Thank you. That one's an exciting one to look out for.
Indeed. There's a reference to birth registration. Yes, that's the goal of SDG 16.9, absolutely. And certainly we've been partnering with UNICEF and Plan International to support their goal on achieving birth reg for all. Pakistan and Tanzania as two countries where our members there have particularly done quite an elaborate job at supporting digital birth reg solutions, and happy to provide more data or resources to anyone who's interested.
And we've got a question that's also come in from Robert. And I think this is really relevant because we also, when we heard Pilile speak about the situation in Eswatini, one of the crucial things that they're working on right now is data protection and privacy policies. And so Robert's question is, are there many frameworks in Africa? And I suspect that the answer is, that's something that many African countries are working on. And are things like GDPR, useful to perhaps to use in countries, or, is it too heavy-handed perhaps?
I mean, yeah, that's probably beyond the remit of what we do. I mean, as GSMA, we certainly have our privacy principles and guidelines in terms of, at a higher level, what's the outcomes we're looking to achieve, and what are the objectives that we push and we know that our members apply when it comes to customer data. But then, what governments decide to adopt and which elements of GDPR to adopt, that's not something I think I'm well placed to comment on. Clearly, those practices or those sort of frameworks have to take into account the reality on the ground. But that's not to say that people in country A should have less privacy because of, compared to people in country B. So at the principal level, I think we need to adopt a consistent framework of people's rights and expectations, and ensure the concerns are addressed. And again, happy to share the GSMA's own privacy principles and guidelines that we have, worked on with our members to produce.
I think that would be wonderful if you could share those, and also the links to the Mothbar birth studies registrations as well. We can share them on the post that we'll be putting on campus with the video. So anyone who's interested in reading more can go ahead and delve into that information, which would be fantastic.
Absolutely, happy to share those.
Perfect, thank you. Anyone else got any questions before we start to pull the call to a close? If you have, pop them in the chat or raise up your hand. Just while we're waiting for maybe one or two more questions to come in, I think what really resonated with me is this idea that actually, the use of MNOs is the supply and demand side. That,
yes.
They can have a role to play on either side, which is, I think, really intriguing, and actually really we need to take that seriously. When we're looking at Eswatini, we know that there is reasonable coverage, not perfect, but there is reasonable coverage in the country, and also reasonable penetration of mobile phones as well. So this could be a very interesting idea for Eswatini, definitely to consider. But I mean, we're not just talking about Eswatini, but it is the focus for our case study. So I think that's something really, really key for me. And I really hadn't thought about the idea before, and I've talked about idea a lot, but never the idea of agents, mobile money agents actually playing a role, in helping with the enrollment of, identity. And when we were talking just earlier in our case conversation, we were saying how challenging it can be for rural areas, and vast majority of the population in Swaziland live in those rural areas. Well, perhaps this could be a particular solution for that as well.
Absolutely, yes. And I mean, we haven't worked in Eswatini yet, but I don't know if there are any MNOs on the line today, but we'll be happy to reach out to our members there and convene a dialogue with the relevant government departments if this is something that colleagues on the call would like to pursue as an idea, or even as a sort of initial discussion with our members there. But it certainly does work, and with the examples I mentioned, both on the birth registration side, but also in Nigeria, as I mentioned, it's a simple case of they've got the reach that governments don't have. You have the MNOs on the ground, their agents, their kiosks, their shops, and therefore MNOs, obviously through a public awareness campaign, if they know where to go to register, it's much easier to reach them through the MNO channels. And the data is not stored by the MNO. The data goes to whatever the government databases are, and then seamlessly the MNO can then link whatever the unique identifier of the new digital ID is of the customer to the SIM registration, and that helps sort of meet two objectives in one go. Enroll the customer and make sure that their mobile subscription is linked to that new ID, and therefore mobile then becomes a more robust way to allow access to the demand side services I mentioned before, and address the concern that the colleague from South Africa raised earlier. So yeah, we absolutely promote and would promote partnerships with MNOs to achieve those goals.
Well, it's been such a privilege to have you directly speaking about it. Yesterday, we were lucky enough to have one of the key players in MOSIP, and today we have one of the key players being able to share with us about the role of mobile. So we've been very blessed on these last couple of days to be speaking directly to the people who we might need to reach out to and speak to about getting on board and moving things forward. I'm just going to check in with David and Nawazi to see if they have anything else they'd like to add before we wrap up today's call.
Not from me, just a thanks to Yanis, and it's good to hear of how the whole mobile initiative has expanded, and I'm fascinated by the diversity of use cases and actually encouraged by that, because it seems to me that's the comparative advantage of MNOs in their local context to come up with the use cases like those you've illustrated. So I think we'll all watch with interest. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you again for having me. And I'll just conclude by also mentioning that in the coming year, in 2021, we're launching an innovation fund, which would be aimed sort of with Africa as a key focus country and sort of region rather, and will be aimed at identifying new innovations that leverage mobile and new use cases where mobile can help unblock identity barriers in the context of helping individuals access services remotely and online. And for example, the vaccination context and COVID, I think will be certainly be a key use case to think about. But I'll invite colleagues on the call to also let us know if they feel mobile can play a role in any other use case that we could consider. So thanks again for having me.
It's fascinating, and I really hope that we get people on this call and people in our community to be part of that. That will be fantastic, Yanis, and it's great to see the continual drive cases, and that pulls people towards wanting to use ID and digital ID, not forcing them to use it, which Absolutely. Is the key things that really makes it work. So really exciting. Thank you so much for sharing today with us. I've really enjoyed the call, and the number of questions we've had come in would suggest everyone else has too. And just a quick final reminder for me, tomorrow is our last call. I'm quite sad that we're already almost at the end, but tomorrow is our brainstorming discussion presentation-y type session, where we'll be sharing what thoughts and ideas, suggestions, solutions, what we've heard from our own personal experiences as to what we might recommend for Eswatini in moving forward with their plans and suggestions. We have two groups who are going to be presenting tomorrow, so we look forward to hearing from those. But we also said that anyone individually could contribute. So if you would like 1 or 2 minute slot in tomorrow's call, please either email myself or Nawazi, or you can send us a message on campus, or even I'm going to this call running for a minute or two. If anyone wants to talk to us directly, I will be on the call. And then we can get ready and start to plan for tomorrow's feedback session, which we're really excited for. So thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you, Yanis, again. And we look forward to seeing you 23 hours again tomorrow. Have a good day and evening, everybody.